He's talking about human phenomena and characteristics, you see in the first paragraph. And what does he mean by human phenomena and characteristics? He talks about behavior, belief, genes, income, etc. And he talks about two kinds of, you see, influences. They are influenced, you see, human behavior, human phenomena is influenced by geographic factors and non-geographic factors. That is in the first paragraph. He's talking about two kinds of influences. On the human behavior, one is the geographic and the other is the non-geographic. In the geographic, he's talking about the physical and the biological, that is the climate, the topography, the soil, the wild plants. I mean, all these things come under the geographic factors. And the non geographic factors are culture, history, individual decisions, right? So in the very first paragraph, he is talking about human behavior influenced by geographic and non-geographic factors. Okay, now let's come to the next paragraph. In the next paragraph, he makes a point. He says that when you examine the economies of North and South Korea, right? It cannot be, they are not due to environmental differences. You see, when you find differences in the economy of North and South Korea, it's not due to what you call the environmental differences, but differences due to the policies of the government, different policies of the government. That's what he's making a point there, right? And then he goes on to give you an example about Inuits, right? And he talks about the geographic influence on the Inuits. And what is the geographic influence? That is, they have fur coats but no agriculture, because it's the demand of the what you call environment there. And then he talks about equatorial lowlands, people living in the equatorial lowlands, right? And they have agriculture, but they are influenced by non-geographic factors, and they are what you call they tend to agriculture. And then he gives you a third example about the Aboriginal Australians, right? The hunters. And then he says that that's an example of the biogeographic, because the Australian continent, he says that there's been no proof that they had ever any domestic animals, you see, or even domestic plants. Everything was imported. They are all non-native products, right? And now he comes to the third paragraph, and he talks about that all the scholarship and the scholars, you see, they cannot deny the fact that culture, history, individual choices, you see, cast a great influence that cannot be denied. And then there is something known as denouncing, you see, geographic determinism. That is, everything is determined by geography. And he says, he gives you three reasons for this view about this geographic determinism. And the three reasons are: number one, first of all, he says that geographic, what you call, explanations were generally considered racist. Number two, the other reason he gives is contingency. What does he mean by contingency? That is, it's a word that is the individual decisions and chance and choices, you see, and that's stressed by the historians. And the last reason he gives you for that is geographic explanation depend on detailed technical facts of geography and other fields, and possibly historians may not have been trained in those fields. Okay, so this is all about the paragraph that I just discussed. And now let's come to the questions. Look at the first question. He says all of the following are advanced by the author as reasons why non geographers disregard. Look at the sentence. Why non geographers disregard geographic influences on human phenomena, except, except. So let's look at the reasons here. Number one, belief in the central role of humans unrelated to physical surroundings in influencing phenomena. So this is one reason. You see, all of the following are advanced by the author as reasons why non-geographers disregard geographic influences on human phenomena, except one. So number two, disciplinary training, which typically does not include technical knowledge of geography. Number three, dismissal of explanations that involve geographical causes for human behavior. That is number three. The answer is number three, and lingering impressions of past geographic analysis that were politically offensive. Well, he hasn't talked about that there. Now let's move to the next question. The examples of Inuit and Aboriginal Australians are offered in the passage to show. To show what? If you remember in paragraph number 2, he talks about the Inuits and what you call the Aboriginal Australians, and he makes a statement there. And what statement does it make? He talks about the fur coat that is worn by the Inuits, right? If you go to what you call at the opposite extreme, then the second paragraph, the Inuit and other traditional peoples living north of the Arctic Circle developed warm fur clothes and no agriculture. Okay, I told you about that. And about the Aboriginal Australians, he talks about how they don't have something which is their own, whether animals or plants. They have been all non-native. So he says here, these two examples are given in the past to show what? Number one, that despite geographical isolation, traditional societies were self-sufficient and adaptive. No, that cannot be the answer. How environmental factors lead to a comparatively divergent paths in livelihoods and development. He doesn't talk about so much in detail about these things. Human resourcefulness across cultures in adapting to their surroundings, that is a general statement. And how physical circumstances can dictate human behavior in cultures. That is the answer. Number 4, how physical circumstances can dictate human behavior and cultures, because he's being specific from what has been discussed in paragraph number 1. Now let's come to the third question. It says here, all of the following can be inferred from the passage. Yes, you can draw all of these from the passage except one. Let's see that. Agricultural practices changed drastically in the Australian continent after it was colonized, possibly because they started getting what you call things from other countries. You see, individual diktat and contingency were not the causal factors for the use of fur clothing in some very cold climates. Obviously, you can infer that from the passage. It has nothing to do with individual diktat or contingency, you see, for that matter. The physical conditions were more important. Number 3, several academic studies of human phenomena in the past involved racist interpretations. No, he's not talking about you see, in that sense, you can infer this much from the passage that, of course, academic studies you see of human phenomena, you see, possibly ended up with racism. So that is given in the passage. And last, while most human phenomena result from culture and individual choice, some are biogeographic origins. Well, the second part is partially correct, but the first part is incorrect. You see, that cannot be inferred that human phenomena, you see, result from culture and individual choice. No, in fact, they are influenced by both geographic and non-geographic factors that have been given in the first paragraph. Number 4 cannot be inferred. So the answer is number 4. Now let's come to the next question. The author criticizes scholars who are not geographers for all of the following reasons. You see, if you remember, he gives you 3 reasons also, and then he talks about the last line. He says most historians and economists don't acquire that detailed knowledge as part of the professional training which a geographer has, right? So now he says here, for all of the following reasons, except one, Their labeling of geographic explanations as deterministic. Okay, that's correct because they talk about cultural determinism, historical determinism, geographic determinism. Number two, their outdated interpretations of past cultural and historical phenomena. Now, that is something you see is not given, you see, that is not a reason. So, the answer is number two. The importance of their place on the role of individual decisions when studying human phenomena, that is a non-geographic factor. Their rejection of the role of the biogeographic factors in social and cultural phenomena, that again is something which is non-geographic. So the correct answer is number two. You have a passage here which has to do with wolf. Lupine, Lupine, lupine has to do with the wolf. Now, that seems to be an interesting paragraph. And in the first paragraph, he talks about the menace of wolves. You see, the danger from the wolves that, in particular, you see certain villages and you see hamlets in France faced during a particular period of time. The wolves can be seen over the forest, the hillsides, and they have been a problem to most of the farmers there. It's different that tourists, you see, may enjoy visiting such places for the sake of looking at the wolves. But the farmers, you see, they have problems because their livestock, you see, the sheep, the goats that they tend to, you see, the wolves kill them. So in paragraph number one, that is the main point. In paragraph number two, he talks about the control of the wolf population. And then he gives you two dates. You see, he says that those official hunters and others completed their job in the 1930s. That is, they did away with all the wolves. The wolves were done away with, and the farmers had a good time. But then, somewhere in the 1990s, you see, the wolves reappeared. And again, you see, what had happened was they started infesting the mainland. And that was a problem for the farmers because they lost thousands of sheep and grazing animals. But the point is, you have animal activists, the green activists, animal activists, and politics there, and they wanted to save the wolves. Now, the farmers were finding a bad time, you see, from the 1990s onwards. In the 1990s, you see, the wolves returned. Now, in the third paragraph, he's talking about the reasons why you see wolves return. Why did they return? What was the reason? And then, if you go through the paragraph closely, you'll find out the basic reason is the increase in forest area. The increase in forest area, you see, facilitated the wolves to return. Once upon a time, you had more than a lack of residents, more than a lack of people inhabiting those villages. But then somewhere in the 1990, you see, you find that the number you see has fallen down to 80,000. The forest area had increased, the woodland area had increased. And then, moreover, there had been ban on hunting also, a kind of ban, the decline of hunting as a sport. And because of this, what had happened was, you see, the wolf population, you see, increased after the 1990s. And then in the last paragraph, he says that as the lupine population of Europe spread westwards with occasional reports of wolves seen closer to urban areas. So then what had happened was there was a clash between the farmers and the wolves, right? And he says, of course, the farmers' losses are real. But then again, you have tourist venues, parks, where wolves are kept and the animal spread is discussed. Also generate income and jobs in rural areas, right? It's one point that the coming of the wolves, you see, they destroyed the farmers, what you call livestock and cattle. But at the same time, you see, uh, other sources of income was, uh, you see, the place becoming a tourist of spot and people coming and paying for to see the wolves. So that is all about in the passage. Now let's look at the questions here. He says here the author presents a possible economic solution to an existing issue facing Lozère that takes into account the divergent and competing interests of two kinds of people. He talks about that in the first paragraph. And the two kinds are number one, Tourists and environmentalists? No. Environmentalists and politicians? No. Politicians and farmers? No. It's between the farmers and the environmentalists. The farmers, you see, they want to get rid of the predator wolf, and the environmentalists, you see, they want to protect the wolves and the forest area. So the answer is number 4. Which one of the following has not contributed to the growing wolf population in Lozère? Number 1, the granting of a protected status to wolves in Europe. Is that it? No. An increase in woodlands and forest cover in Lozère. In fact, they have contributed to the growing population. Number 3, a decline in the rural population of Lozère. And number 4, the shutting down of the Royal Office of Luparel. That is the answer. The shutting down of the office has not contributed to the growing wolf population. It had nothing to do with that. Okay, so that is the correct answer, number 4. Now, let's look at the next question. He says, which one of the following statements, if true, would weaken the author's claims? So let's look at them. Number 1, having migrated out in the last century, wolves are now returning to Lozère. The old mining sites of Lozère now are being used as grazing pastures for sheep. Unemployment concerns the residents of Lozère. Wolf attack on tourists in Lozère are on the rise. Yes, I mean, if this statement, number 4, you see, if this is true, then the argument would be weak. Why would it be weakened? Because look at the last sentence. He says here, tourist venues such as parks where wolves are kept and animal spread is discussed also generate income and jobs in rural areas. Now, if you were to say that wolf attacks on tourists, you see, are on the rise, then possibly the argument that he gives that this is a source of income for people, it becomes a touristry for people, that would be weakened. So the answer is number 4. The next question, the inhabitants of Lozère have to grapple with all of the following problems except what? Let's see. They have to grapple with the problem of livestock losses. Yes. Poor rural communication infrastructure. Possible. Yes. Decline in the number of hunting licenses. Well, that is the answer, right? That is the answer. Decline in the number of hunting licenses, lack of educational facilities. You see, all these 3 problems, livestock losses, poor rural communication infrastructure, and lack of educational facilities, they might have to grapple with them, except one, and that is the decline in the number of hunting licenses. This is not a problem, you see, to face for the inhabitants of Lozère. In fact, you see, if you look at the last but one paragraph where he talks about 1.1 million people holding hunting licenses, through though the number of active hunters is probably lower. So the answer is number 3. We'll just quickly see what the passage is all about. He says here, the post-colonial literature. Now, what do you mean by post-colonial? The post-colonial has to do with those countries where possibly the Englishman ruled. That is the popular meaning, right? It could be the French or the English, because these were the 2 countries, you see, that had colonized other nations, like the French Congo. France, you see, colonized certain areas of Africa. So after they left, they call those areas post-colonial, right? After the colonization. In India, in Indian literature also, literature that was written after 1947, in English, they call it the post-colonial literature, because the Englishman left India. You see, the British left India in the 1947. So you have this all over the world, you see the post-colonial literature. He says in the first paragraph, he's talking about, he says that post-colonial literature, the world of novel was often the nation. Possibly, you have to get a knowledge of these things. Novelists, you see, who wrote, you see, after the colonizer left the country, they generally wrote about their own nation, about their own country. In India also, we have examples of that. Writers writing in English, you see, they would write about the nation. post-colonial novel, right? So, and they were concerned with questions that had to do with the nation, you see, right? And it says in the first paragraph, sometimes the whole story of the novel was taken as an allegory of the nation. That is, there was a hidden meaning. There was a hidden meaning in the novel. An allegory is a hidden meaning which runs parallel with the literal meaning, right? So even if it was not directly about the nation, but a close reading would tell you that there was a hidden meaning that has to do with the nation. Okay, this was important for supporting anti-colonial nationalism, but could also be limiting land-focused and inward-looking. Land-focused, why? Because it is all about the nation, and inward-looking, so writer's own ideas, you see, that have come up. Anti-colonial nationalism is, of course, a nationalism which has to do with feelings of bitterness against the colonizer, against the person, against the country that ruled over us. Okay, so in the first paragraph, the main point that he makes is that the post-colonial literature, the novel, had to do with the nation. Okay, in the second paragraph, he's talking about his own book, new book, Writing Ocean Worlds. And he says that it expresses another kind of the world of novel. It's not about the village or the nation, but it is about the Indian Ocean world. Now, if he's talking about the Indian Ocean world, what does he mean? You can see that in the third paragraph at the very beginning, the Indian Ocean world is a term used to describe the long lasting connections among the coasts of East Africa, the Arab coast, and the South and East Asia. So, novels that were limited to the Indian Ocean, you see that. That's what he's talking about. That is, talking about the Indian Ocean, you see. And of course, in the second paragraph, I just switched on to the third. Sorry, I just skipped to the skipped the second one and came to the third to explain what it meant. Right. So the novels had to do with what you call the. They're all the setting, the environment is the Indian Ocean. And if you look into the in the second paragraph, he says that the book describes a set of novels in which the Indian Ocean is at the center of the story. And of course, you have novels by, say, what you call Conrad or Amitav Ghosh. You see Conrad's, you have The Heart of Darkness and other novels. And then you have Amitav Ghosh, the Indian writer, you see, Abdul Razak Gurna and Lindsay Collin. You have all these people talking about the center, you see, is the Indian Ocean. And their work reveals a world that is outward looking. See, he talked about the inward looking in the first paragraph, and the second he's talking about the outward looking. And what is outward looking? It is full of movement, border crossing, and south interconnection. That's the thing. And it says that they're all very different, but the basic thing is the wider sense of the Indian Ocean. That's what he is talking about. And he says this is the effect of remapping the world in the reader's mind as centered in the interconnected global south. Right, it's something new to the mind of the reader. And now in the third paragraph, he defines the Indian Ocean, what you call novel, the Indian Ocean world. And then he talks about the travel by sea was much easier by land. And then he goes on to, he says that historical and archaeological evidence suggests that what we now call globalization first appeared in the Indian Ocean, right? Why? He says this is the interconnected oceanic world referenced and produced by the novels in my book. Why does he call that globalization? Because it is inclusive of so many countries, you see, so many places. That is why he calls it what you call globalization. Now, in the third paragraph, he's talking particularly about, say, Ghosh, Gurna, and Colin and Conrad. He talks about them. And if you look into the paragraph closely, he says they reference a different set of histories and geographies than the ones most commonly found in fiction in English. And what are these most commonly found fiction? Are mostly centered in Europe or the US, assume a background of Christianity and whiteness. and mention places like Paris and New York. Now, the general novel, the novels which are written, you see, pre-colonial times, right? Written during what you call the times that were not, you see, colonial. They have to do with Christianity and whiteness, and they are centered in Paris and New York. But here it's different. Here you have what you call the ports of Malindi, Mombasa, Aden, Java, Bombay, Islamic space, right? So it is something which is really highly imaginative, and it has a cosmopolitan touch, you see, everywhere. Now he says this is a remapping. Remapping, that is, this has changed, right? And remapping is particularly powerful for the representation of Africa in the fiction. Sailors, travelers are not all European. Africa, as well as Indian and Arab characters, are traders. So you have a different feel. I hope you now understand it. I mean, the post-colonial literature is totally different from the other kinds of literature you see. The novel is different. It's not centered in Paris or New York or the white man or the Christianity. No, it has to do with people who live in Africa, who live in Asia, who live in India. It's something different, right? And then he concludes the whole thing by saying that what it does mean is that the African part of the Indian Ocean world plays an active role in its long, rich history, and therefore is that of the wider world. That he talks about the globalization which has been carried. Now, let's look into the questions here. All of the following claims contribute to the remapping discussed by the passage except. And that one claim is for number one, Indian Ocean novels have gone beyond the specifics of national concerns to explore rich regional paths. That is correct. It contributes to the remapping. The world of early international trade and commerce was not the sole domain of white Europeans. No, it wasn't. The Africans, the Asians were also there. The global south, as opposed to the global north, was the first center of globalization. That's correct. He has talked about the south interconnectedness. I think in paragraph number 3 also he has talked about that. And cosmopolitanism originated in the West and traveled to the East through globalization. No, that is incorrect, you see, right? That's an exception. Cosmopolitanism didn't originate in the West. Now, let's look at the next question. He says, all of the following statements, if true, would weaken the passage's claim about the relationship between mainstream English language fiction and the Indian Ocean novels, except one statement, which would not weaken. And what is that? And that is, number one, he says, very few mainstream English language novels have historically been set in American and European metropolitan centers. Okay. Number two, the decision of Africa and most Indian Ocean novels is the depiction is driven by a post-colonial nostalgia for an idyllic past. The depiction of Africa in most Indian Ocean novels is driven by an Orientalist imagination of its cultural coolness. And the last, most mainstream English language novels have historically privileged the Christian white male experience, travel, and adventure. Right. So this last point he has already made there in the 1, 2, 3, 4th paragraph. Right. And that is the correct answer, number 4. The next question, on the basis of the nature of the relationship between the items in each pair below, choose the odd pair out. Okay, let us see. Post-colonial novels, border crossing. Post-colonial novels, anti-colonial nationalism. That's correct, right? He talks about that in the first paragraph. Indian Ocean novels, outward looking. He has already talked about that in what you call in paragraph, I think, number 2. The outward looking, the Indian Ocean novels are outward looking. Indian Ocean world slavery, that's correct. We have talked about that. The odd one out is number 1, post-colonial novels and border crossing. Which one of the following statements is not true about migration in the Indian Ocean world? Migration in the Indian Ocean world was an ambivalent experience. Okay, that seems to be true. Geographical location rather than geographical proximity determined the choice of destination for migrants. Okay, the Indian Ocean's world's migration networks were shaped by religious and commercial histories of the region. And the last one, the Indian Ocean world's migration networks connected the global north with the global south. No, it doesn't talk about the connection between north and south. So that is the answer number four. And the next passage you see is about an essay by Marshall Sahlins, Original Affluent Society. He raises an argument and then he tries to prove that it's not always the desire to earn more and more that leads to what you call more consumption, more production. What is Marshall Salin is doing here is he gives you an instance of the hunters, the foragers, and he points out that these hunters and foragers, they were all a satisfied group of people. They were content with hunting, and whatever income they had out of it, they were happy with it. They never demanded more. He wants to deconstruct the popular notion that the consumer keeps on demanding more and therefore the production has to increase. If you look at the first paragraph, Stalin's principal argument was simple but counterintuitive. Before being driven into the marginal environments by colonial powers, hunter gatherers or foragers were not engaged in a desperate struggle for meager survival. They weren't engaged in a desperate struggle. They were satisfied with their needs, with far less work than people in agricultural and industrial societies. The hunters or the foragers, you see, they would find time for themselves after hunting. They would sell their what you call a hunt, and they would be just what you call be happy with it. The so-called Neolithic revolution, rather than improving life, imposed a harsher work regime and set in motion the long history of growing inequality. So the Neolithic revolution, you see, that brought about, you see, competition in the minds of people, and they started, you see, racing ahead. They wanted to earn more, but he says if you go back into the past, that is different, and it was their own choice. They wanted to live a life of what you call contentment. In the second paragraph, he says that the hunters had alternatives, but then they rejected those alternatives. They didn't want to earn more. They were satisfied with what they were earning. They demonstrated that societies make real choices. Culture, a way of living oriented around a distinctive set of values and manifest a fundamental principle of collective self-determination. That is, they were determined as a society. When he says the point of the essay is not so much about the empirical validity of the data. Now, what is he trying to tell us is that is, it has a conceptual challenge to contemporary economic life and bourgeois individualism. The empirical served a philosophical and political project, a thought experiment, and stimulus to the imagination of the possibilities. He's trying to point out, well, if the hunters, so the foragers, you see, could have led a life of that kind in the past, then why do we talk about all this competition and all this consumerism in the present? We as human beings could live the same way. And now the writer takes up another example. You see, the Affluent Society, written by John Kenneth Galbraith. The first essay was by Salin. The second essay is by Galbraith. And what does Galbraith say? He talks about the post-war prosperity of America, the inequalities, you see, and then what happens after that. And he says here, the original affluent society brought this critical perspective to bear on the contemporary world. It did so through the classic anthropological move of showing that radical alternatives to the reader's lives really exist. If the capitalist world seeks wealth through ever greater material production to meet infinitively expansive desires, foraging societies follow the Zen road to influence not by getting more but by wanting less. So that is the main point that I have been trying to explain. It's not the desire to get more; it's the desire to for getting less. You're satisfied with whatever you have, and that is an example of the foraging community. Otherwise, if you look at the affluent society, the essay, it's all about consumerism, how people demand, how production has to increase, and how inequalities are created. So that is the main point that he has said. And in the last paragraph, he talks about viewed in the In today's context, of course, not every aspect of the essay has aged well. While acknowledging the violence of colonialism, racism, and dispersion, it does not thematize them as heavily as we might today. Rebuking evolutionary anthropologists for treating present day foragers as left behind by progress, it took and succumbed to the temptation to use them as proxies for the Paleolithic. Yet these characteristics should not distract us from appreciating Salin's effort to show that if we want to conjure new possibilities, we need to learn about actually inhabitable worlds. So the point is, if you try to read the example of the hunters and gatherers in the present context, if you want to read them in the present context, and the basic thing is you've got to appreciate what Salin said. And what Salin said was that if we demand less, then we are satisfied. Then this raise, this price rise, this inflation, this consumerism would possibly be cut down. Now, let us look at the 13th question. The author mentions Tanzania's Hadza community to illustrate. You have that, I think, in the second paragraph. He wants to illustrate that forager communities' lifestyles derive not from ignorance about alternatives, but from their own choice. It's not that they didn't have alternatives, but they had a choice of their own that they demanded less. You have that in the first line of the second paragraph. Who had long been surrounded by farmers knew that they had alternatives and rejected them. So the correct answer is number 4. Now let us look at the next question. We can infer that Salin's main goal in writing his essay was to highlight the fact that while we started off as a fairly contented egalitarian people, we have progressively degenerated into materialism. No, that is not the aim. He's not trying to tell us that we were, you see, egalitarians and then we have degenerated into materialism. It isn't that. Okay. Put forth the view that despite egalitarian origins, economic progress brings greater inequality and social hierarchies. These are the points you see that are made in the passage, but that's not the goal. What is the aim? Counter Galbraith's pessimistic view of the inevitability of a capitalist trajectory for economic growth. The aim is to hold a mirror to an acquisitive society with examples of other communities that have chosen successfully to be non-materialist. Yes, that is an aim. The aim is to tell the society where you are all acquisitive people, and if you choose, you can be non-materialistic, like the hunter-gatherers are. Now, let's come to the next question. The author of the passage criticizes Salin's essay for its what? For its outdated values regarding present day foragers versus ancient foraging communities. No. He criticizes Salin's essay for its cursory treatment of the effects of racism and colonialism on society. Because Salin doesn't talk about, you see, the racism and colonialism and effect on societies. He has just, you see, given it cursory treatment. That is where he is criticized by the writer. So the correct answer is number 2. Let us go to the next question. The author of the passage mentions Galbraith's The Affluent Society too. The answer to this is to show how Galbraith theories refute Salin's thesis. No, that is not the answer. That how Galbraith's theories refute Salin's thesis on the contentment of pre-hunter-gatherer communities. No. Show how Salin's views complemented Galbraith's criticism of the consumerism and the inequality of contemporary society. That is a point that Galbraith makes. You see about consumerism, and the resultant inequality. So number 2 is the correct answer. Now let's come to the next question. You have to look into the context. This philosophical cut at one's course, beliefs, values, and way of life is difficult enough. Now look at you have got a clue here. This philosophical cut. That means the preceding part must be talking about a cut, a reduction in some kind of philosophy. The experience of reading philosophy is often disquieting. When reading philosophy, the values around which one has heretofore organized one's life may come to look provincial, flatly wrong, or even evil. When beliefs previously held as truths are rendered implausible. That is, you had beliefs, you had truths, and they are rendered implausible. That is, they lose their what you call practicality. New beliefs, values, and way of living may be required. So something has gone, something has reduced. So number two option, this philosophical cut at one's course, beliefs, and way of life is difficult enough. I think option two, that is the place where you have this sentence, because after option two, you see he says difficult enough, and then what is worse? One thing is difficult, something that is coming that's going to be worse. And if you look at number three, for instance, he says here, what's worse, philosophers admonish each other to remain unsutured until such time as a dispensable nuance is revealed or constructed. Sometimes philosophical writing is even strictly critical in that it does not even attempt to provide an alternative after tearing down a cultural or conceptual citadel. Now you can't put here this philosophical cut at one's course beliefs. Now because he's not talking about beliefs or values in the preceding line. And if you look at the last one, he says here, while reading philosophy can help one clarify one's value and even make one self-conscious for the first time of the fact that there are good reasons for believing what one believes, it can also generate unremediated doubt that is difficult to live with. Now, he is only talking about good reasons for believing in why you believe in a certain way. Now, you can't say this philosophical cut. There is no cut involved there. In 18, you have a sentence here. The discovery helps to explain archaeological similarities between the Paleolithic peoples of China, Japan, and the Americas. The discovery. That means the preceding line or the line that follows has to do with what you call the discovery. He says here, the researchers also uncovered an unexpected genetic link between Native Americans and Japanese people. Now, if you say they uncovered an unexpected genetic link between Native Americans and Japanese people, you can't put this sentence here. During the deglaciation period, another group branched out from northern coastal China and traveled to Japan. We were surprised to find that this ancestral source also contributed to the Japanese gene pool, especially the indigenous Ainus, says Lee. They shared similarities. Now, what does they refer to? We don't have they here. We don't have an antecedent for they here. If you look at option one here, right? One, if you look at one, in one, you cannot put this sentence because just making one statement about the genetic link, you can't talk about the archaeological similarity. Okay. Now, the second point is during the deglaciation period. When, if you talk about the deglaciation period, another group branched out from, you have this here and traveled to Japan, and then you have an ancestral source, right? After this, in option three, you can say that discovery helps to explain the archaeological similarities between the Paleolithic people of China, Japan, and Americas. They shared similarities. Okay, so you have here similarities. In that way, option two is correct. In English, there is no systematic rule for naming numbers. So he's talking about after 10, you have 11, and then 12, and then all of them are teens up to 20, before up to 19. Okay. Number two, he says, even more confusingly, some English words invert the numbers. They refer to the word 14 because he says that 4 comes first and then you have teen. And then you have, it can take children a while to learn all these words and understand what 14 is different from 40. For multiples of 10, English speakers switch to a different pattern, 20, 30, 40, and so on. If you don't know the word for 11, you would not be able to just guess it. You might come up with something like 1T. So you see, he is talking about the nomenclature of numbers. He's not talking about whether children will be able to learn those numbers or not. So 1, 2, 4, and 5, they can be put into what you call a logical whole. But 3 cannot find a place there. So number 3 is the odd one out. Now let's look into the next one. Having an appreciation for the working of another person's mind is considered a prerequisite for a natural language acquisition, strategic social interaction, reflexive thought, and moral judgment. Then he talks about it is a theory of mind, though some scholars prefer to call it mentalizing or mind reading, which is important for the development of one's cognitive ability. Though we must speculate about its evolutionary origin, we do not have indications that the capacity involved sometime in the last few million years. This capacity develops from early beginnings in the first year of life to the adult's fast and often effortless understanding of others' thoughts, feelings, and intentions. Okay. One of the most fascinating human capacities is the ability to perceive and interpret other people's behavior in terms of their mental states. Look what he says at the very first sentence. For the workings of another person's mind is considered a prerequisite for natural language acquisition. Now, if that is the case, you see, when you talk about the human capacities, the capacity you see which develops from the early beginnings in the first year of your life, right? And then you talk about the origin of those capacities, and then you talk about, you see, your capacity for natural language acquisition. So in that case, number two is the odd one out. We are not talking about the theory of mind, you see, or mentalizing or mind reading. And he's talking about the cognitive abilities. We are not talking about the cognitive abilities as such. Now let's look at the next exercise. You have to make a coherent paragraph out of these sentences. Algorithms hosted on the internet are accessed by many, so biases in AI models have resulted in much larger impact, adversely what you call affecting far larger groups of people. Now, if you look at these sentences, let us look at which sentence can be the first one. Though algorithm bias is the popular term, the foundation of such bias is not what you call in algorithms, but in the data. Okay. Despite there, option number four should be the first option. Here it talks about the impact of biased decisions made by humans is localized and geographically confined. But with the advent of AI, the first time he's talking about AI, the impact of such decisions is spread out over a much wider scale. And then he goes on to talk about, you see, so biases in AI models have resulted in much larger impact. That is in number one. So after four, it should be number one. And after number one, you have number two. Why number two? He has talked about the bias and he says, though algorithmic bias is the popular term. And then you have, of course, as algorithms merely reflect persistent patterns that are present in the training data, despite their widespread impact. So number three should be the last. 4123. He says here, what precisely are the unusual elements that make a particular case so attractive to a certain kind of audience? It might be a particularly savage or unfathomable level of depravity. Very often it has something to do with the precise amount of mystery involved. Unsolved and perhaps unsolvable cases offer something that ordinary murder doesn't. Why are some crimes destined for perpetual re-examination and others locked into permanent obscurity? Okay, so if he is talking about cases solved, unsolved, and the nature of the cases, then you have number four as the first sentence. Why are some crimes destined for perpetual re-examination and others locked into oblivion? So if crimes, you see, they are re-examined and others are what you call relegated to oblivion or obscurity, then the point is, what precisely are the unusual elements that make a particular case so attractive to a certain kind of audience? Why are people attracted to a particular case that they want to re-examine it, or for instance, they want to talk about it? And then the third one would be number two. It might be a particularly savage or unfathomable level of depravity. Very often it has something to do with the precise amount of mystery involved. There's some kind of mystery involved, and that is why people want the case to be re-examined or to be re-telecast. Or and then the last one is number three. Unsolved or perhaps unsolvable cases offer something that ordinary murder does. That is the reason. So the correct answer is 4123. Now, if you look at the passage, he's talking about manipulating information, right? And in history, information was manipulated, but now with modern day journalism, you see, you have certain rules. Now he talks about record dates back to the ancient Rome, where you see Antony met Cleopatra, and they were political enemies. You see, and then Octavian, what he did, he launched what he call a slander, a smear campaign against Antony, right, with short, sharp slogans written upon coins. Now, Octavian, what he did, he was spreading fake news about Antony, because possibly it's not always necessary to know the background, but then it see, if you look into history, it was Antony had married, you see, Octavian's sister Fulvia, and it was later, you see, that Antony left, you see, Fulvia, and went to Egypt, and then he fell in love with Cleopatra. You see, so Octavian didn't like that. So that is why all this fake news and all these things. But then the perpetrator became the first Roman emperor, and fake news had allowed Octavian to hack the Republican system once and for all. But the 21st century has seen the weaponization of information on an unprecedented scale. Powerful new technology makes the fabrication of content simple, and social networks amplify falsehoods peddled by states. So you have these social networks working, the social media working. They bring you the what you call the truth of any news, fake news for that matter, right? Whether put forward by anyone, you see, whether in any platform. You have technology, but the point is, look, what does he say? Powerful new technology makes the fabrication of content simple, and social networks amplify falsehood peddled by states. So, with the coming of technology, you even have falsehoods also. It's not that they have done away with falsehoods. No, you have now a greater ambit, you see, for falsehoods. So, if you look into the entire, what you call summaries here, use of misinformation for attaining power, a practice that is as old as the Octavian era, is currently fueled by technology. Very good. All 3 points are covered in this. Number one, misinformation of attaining power. Number two, this happened in the Octavian era. And number three, in the present, it is promoted by technology. So, number one is the correct option. The second one, people need to become critical of what they read, since historically weaponization of information has led to corruption. It doesn't talk about corruption and all these things. Octavian used fake news to manipulate people and attain power and influence, just as people do today. It's not about Octavian as such. He's actually giving you an example of the Octavian era, you see. Disinformation, which is mediated by technology today, is not new and has existed since ancient times. So that's incorrect. So number one is the correct option. Colonialism is not a modern phenomenon. World history is full of examples of one society gradually expanding by incorporating adjacent territory and setting its people on newly conquered territory. And then he talks about, in the 16th century, colonialism changed decisively because of technological developments in the navigation that began to connect more remote parts of the world. And then how people moved from one place to another, and how finally they colonized the whole thing. Now, if you want to look at the best summary, that is in number one. Technological advancements in navigation in the 16th century transformed colonialism, enabling Europeans to establish settlements and exert political dominance over distant regions. That is the basic thing, right? The others, you see, don't cover all the points. For instance, number two only talks about colonialism. Okay. And then, as a result of developments in navigation technology, European colonialism led to displacement. No, not displacement of indigenous populations. No, colonialism conceptualized in the 16th century allowed colonizers to expand their territories, establish. He doesn't talk about technology. You see, in I think three and four, technological advancements, you see, aren't mentioned there.